absolutely. So one of the points I make in my research, and it's a point that many would contest, but Western space, our idea of space is something that can be measured. It really is just another kind of place because it exists within a situated cultural understanding of what the world is, that the world is something that can be measured, that space is something that we can calculate in these different ways. That exists within a very particular worldview that not all people share. So I think one way to create these more harmonized research perspectives is to not hold Western science as something that is exceptional or is something that's privileged over other ways of knowing. There's a lot of research in technosciences, specifically through feminist technosciences, that discusses that the relationship between fact and fiction, they're a lot more complicated than we might think, even when it comes to engineering or quantum physics. We hear a lot about the difference between the two-slot experiment and how an electron can be a wave and can also be a particle, and it could be both of these things depending on where you're standing with the sensor when you do the measurement. It could physically change. So we actually do have this potential within Western science to understand that something can be more than one thing at the same time, and that the tools that we use to learn, the different apparatuses that we use, and the position in which we physically stand when we experience things and observe things, and the knowledge we have prior to that point in time, those come with subjectivities, right? There's no such thing as data that hasn't already been interpreted. So we should approach Western scientific research with this same perspective that we tend to approach more humanistic understandings of the world and other ways of being and knowing in the world, such as indigenous ontologies and views of the world. These things aren't so different. When I determine that something is an archaeological site, I've materialized a place. I've pulled something out of the landscape and I've made it something else. It's a form of placemaking. It exists because of my understanding of what an archaeological site is. It's not exceptional to Inuit ways of seeing the world. They're different and they're equal. And I think that we have a tendency to say that without finding ways to work into our research that's more practical. And so I think that's something that scientists need to work on moving forward, including myself. David, I also wanted to ask you, given that we're doing this on webcams right now, how has COVID affected your work? I think you mentioned that you went into the field, but things went a little differently, and that also had to do with these enriching community relationships that you've been building.
Yeah, things have been interesting during the pandemic, that's for sure. We were not able to spend as much time working with our Malagasy collaborators as we were hoping to, those of us based in the United States. But I was able to head out into the field and do some of our surveys of microclimate and frogs. But luckily, we were able to build upon that with the strength of our local collaborations. I handed off some of the protocols that I had been developing and continued to brainstorm with some of the graduate students in Madagascar that I work with. And they were able to continue some of our field surveys without my need to be there on the ground. So in some ways, it was a really immense challenge trying to figure things out during the pandemic, where we had this giant wrench thrown into the mix. But at the same time, it was pretty enlightening in that we were able to manage most of our work in the same fashion without necessarily having the American scientists there on the ground. And of course, there's tons of part of the research that doesn't just take place in the field. We had this really nice strength where some of my Malagasy collaborators were able to collect the data in the field and then send it off to me where I could run some of the statistical analyses and models back here in the United States. So as a result, we were able to complement some of our strengths and explore a couple more research avenues. For instance, I was able to bring on a Malagasy master's student to help with our field work that he probably wouldn't have been able to have the opportunity otherwise, because I wouldn't have been looking for a larger field team. So it was both a drawback, but also kind of a nice opportunity. And I wonder the same thing with you. I mean, how have you managed during the pandemic, or what are ways that you've kind of attempted to navigate around this mess that we've been in for the past couple of years?
It's definitely changed my research and my plans in terms of the field component of my research has changed a lot because of it. So I haven't been physically in the field since 2019 because of the pandemic. It's just working in such a remote environment with these very small communities, because I do have to pass through them, and we usually work with local collaborators when we go up to do our field work. There just wasn't a safe way to go and visit these communities with the
Yeah.
risk of COVID, especially because a lot of these communities don't have hospitals. They typically have a nurse and a small health center, but they don't have access to a hospital. They have to get flown down for medical care. So
Wow.
Canada had a lot of initiatives in terms of trying to prevent COVID from reaching these remote communities. And researchers on top of that were very cautious, even as things are opening up, we're all still being quite cautious. There's a potential that I might go into the field early this September because I'm fully vaccinated now, and because the community is fully vaccinated, or at least most people in the community are. I'm just
Nice.
waiting to see how it plays out to make sure that vaccination is enough in the community and that there is no contact spread from the different communities as people begin to move around again. But most likely I'll be able to do a very short trip. But like I mentioned before, summer is very short and this will be the fall. So there might be some snowfall. That might be a different thing I have to work around in terms of being able to excavate, but hopefully I'll be able to at least do the drone surveys as long as the weather cooperates more or less. I would say that the thing that's been very difficult for me isn't so much the field work, because I do have tons of data because of the geospatial data I collected. A lot of archaeology, really, we think about field work and trowel and digging in the ground, but that's maybe
Right,
10% of what archaeologists do. You can see all these lovely bones behind me. There's a lot of stuff that we dig out of these sites, and then it all has to be cleaned, conserved, cataloged before it could be sent to the Museum of Natural History. So there's a lot that goes into our work outside of the field. I can't say that I've run out of work that I need to do that's related to my project. So I'm in a really good position when I do get to go into the field again. But the thing that I think has been the hardest is my charity. So usually in relation to the archaeological field work, we run a kids camp. This was something that was created, well, inspired because of my high school teacher that I mentioned. She actually ran these educational programs for much younger kids, and I used to volunteer with her. And she helped me create this program up north in Igloolik in the community that I work in. So it was really disappointing to finally get the charity off the ground and to run the camp, just to have to take this hiatus and not know when it'll be safe to do that again. So hopefully if I go up in September, kids will be in school, so I can't run a full day camp, but I might be able to do an after school version of the camp in September. So here's hoping.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, that sounds like an amazing initiative and a really nice way of giving back to the community. We've been trying to start an education program. It was actually the idea of the Malagasy master's student that I work with, where he's developing educational pamphlets for the village members so they can learn a little bit more of the scientific knowledge about the frog species there. And we're hoping to have a little bit more of exchange in that respect in order to give back, from, as opposed to going out there and doing this parachute science of jumping in and collecting data and disappearing afterwards. And I wonder, with your work, talking about your charity sounds like a really exciting product that comes from your work out there. For your research and the parts of your dissertation, the questions you're asking, what are some of the products that you're hoping to come from this? How do you think your research insights will be used?
The first one I think is more methodological, epistemological. So
Okay.
more in the sense of I'm sort of doing a proof of concept thing that we actually can use these different types of technologies in terms of the drone data and the satellite data and the geophysical stuff, so that we can enrich our data sets and make them more robust so we can understand more broader scale human land relationships. So I would say that that's one research output that I'm really excited about that I think will benefit archaeology in polar tundra sort of environments, because there's all of these logistic issues that will be a big benefit. The second is that while Inuit collaboration is a very common thing when working in early Inuit or historic Inuit archaeology, it's not as common when working with Tunit, given that they were a different culture, a different biological people. I think that one research output that I'm really excited about is by demonstrating how Inuit aren't simply this ethnographic analogy that we can use and sort of just project on the past. We can't say that these different peoples, that all peoples that hunt and gather and subsist, that they all have these commonalities because they have certain overlaps in their economic practices. Instead, I'm going about an approach where I see Inuit and Tunit as being a part of a shared landscape history. And I'm hoping by showing how the things that Tunit did 5,000 years ago sort of set certain processes in play that continue to affect Inuit today, that I can demonstrate that this is a shared unified history and that I can shine a little bit more light on who the true stakeholders are when it comes to these particular landscapes. So as an example, in the interview component of my research, I come across a lot of knowledge holders, specifically elders, saying things like that a particular stone monument, a particular Inukshuk that is located near one of these sites, that it is in fact several thousand years old and it was built by the first people that came here. It was built by the Tunit. And that's interesting because it's not something that I can easily date. I can radiocarbon date organic samples. It's very difficult to grab a date on a statue without destroying a really big part of that statue or monument. So having that data is really valuable. But the interesting thing is the social connections that Inuit have with this non-Inuit heritage, right? This idea that the people that I study prepared the landscape for the Inuit, and that there is this bond and this attachment and this historic connection. And I think that's really important too, because archaeologists often act like they're the dominant authority on this particular history, but this isn't a dead history. We're not studying a dead culture. We're studying sites of living memory that people continue to become with and communities continue to be shaped by. So I'd say in terms of how research in my field can be approached in the future, those are the two main areas.
And moist there, but they may also in the agricultural areas find shady trees or streams where they can get that same microclimate that they need. And the agricultural landscapes may therefore provide just the amount of thermal suitability that the frogs need in the forest. So ultimately, we're trying to understand what is the conservation value of the forest versus the agricultural landscapes. And ultimately, we're hoping for that to inform the decisions being made of priorities of what parts of land ought to be protected and kept away from human influence, as opposed to other parts of the landscape that can have more of a sustainable agriculture practice. This also can be helpful for understanding which frog species are most vulnerable, both to deforestation and to climate change. So by measuring our thermal tolerance of different amphibian species, we may be able to understand these are the frog species that may be at most risk for global warming, as opposed to other ones that are much more tolerant of warming temperatures. So we're hoping for some of our research to be used for both expanding our ecological understanding of these natural landscapes, and the more practical sense of what are our priorities, what's out there that we really need to protect.
I really love that. I have a personal question that's not so much research related, but I couldn't leave this talk without asking, what is your favorite frog? What is your favorite frog species and why?
Well, that's a tricky one. It's hard to limit it down. I think I would have to choose one of my favorite frogs in Madagascar, which is Mentella baroni. They're a beautiful species that are lit up with all these amazing colors. And the Mentellid genus is like the poison dart frogs of Central and South America, where they're poisonous. But luckily for humans, they're not toxic enough so that ecologists like me can get away with going and catching them in the field. So they're definitely one of my favorites. And as for you, what do you think is the part of fieldwork or your research that you're most looking forward to getting back into when you get a chance to go back?
It might sound generic, especially because it's not directly related to my research questions. I picked my research questions because I really am interested in these big picture things, but the most exciting part of archaeology is when you uncover a piece of art, some special artifact. That's just the most amazing part in terms of like the exhilarating rush of being in the field. For me, it's when I find shamans' objects, things that I know were very meaningful to people. And I absolutely love when I find something like a little ivory pendant and it's polished in one particular spot. And I just know that was from someone's thumb and like I can hold it. And I know that 3,000 years ago, somebody was holding this and they were rubbing their thumb on this little seal pendant that they probably kept on their person all the time. And then I think about how crazy it is that I'm able to hold that now. And, I feel connected to other generations. I feel more connected to the world. And yeah, it just makes things seem really fantastical. So that's probably my favorite part in terms of specific moments. The next thing that I find most exciting is when my methods actually work and I actually do uncover a site that we didn't know about. That's pretty cool too, but a little bit less emotional.
Or it can be just as emotional, and I imagine can be totally new and exciting discovery in a lot of ways. Maybe as one more question to leave the audience with is, for both of our research programs and the systems we work with, what do you think is a takeaway for when we go out and explore and walk with nature? What is something that we should all be considering just a bit more, in your opinion?
I think we need to pay more attention, and I think this relates to both of our research, to the different
Yeah.
scales, not just at which the things we're interested in our research happen, but the scales at which life actually takes place, right? The fact that there are things so much smaller than us and things so much grander than us, and that these aren't isolated things, just, when with cultural systems, just like with biological, ecological systems, these different relations on these different scales, they're all connected. Everything's a part of this complex network. And I think as researchers, we sometimes get a little myopic. We get a little about end products. And when we do that, the irony is that we tend to limit what those products can be in a way that isn't the best for our research. And I think that we really need to throw ourselves into the field. We really do need to walk with nature, and we need to be aware of the environments we're in, the responsibility we have in the stories that we tell as researchers, to the work we do in these communities, to how we articulate the knowledge that we're creating through our experience of these places as we participate in them. So I think that we really do need to look around us more, smell the roses, and think about the different things that influence how we do our research, as well as how our research influences the world that we're so interested in. How about for you, Dave?
Yeah, to answer your question, it's funny because what also came to mind for me is paying more attention in a particular way of when we go out on a trail, what may be just a few steps for us is the whole home range of an insect that's been living there, a species that's been there for generations. And so every step that we take may be a completely different world for the small microbiomes and microhabitats that exist there. So having that mindset when I go out into nature has kept me a little bit more humble of how much of a visitor I am in some respects, but also when I'm considerate, how we can be kind of harmonized with our usage of these landscapes. And so it seems for both of us, it's thinking small, but also thinking big, thinking into the future, but also into the past. And the lesson I'm learning is that consideration of all these things is where we get to have a better grasp of what a place is.
Absolutely. If you think about any moment in our research, it really is at the same time both a record or product of the past, of things that have happened either a long time ago or that have just recently happened. But that same moment is always a catalyst of something that will become in the future. Every single little decision, every single relationship that happens in nature, it has an impact on how things will continue to unfold, whether that's socially and culturally, how we experience, express, and understand and imagine landscapes, or on a more biophysical side of things, how landforms will physically change, how, you know, and how the Anthropocene will unfold in terms of climate change and the different practices that we participate in, whether they will help or hinder these ecosystems in general. And I would agree.
Well, Sam, this has been such a pleasure talking with you. You've given me a lot to think about, both for my research and for my further explorations. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you, Dave. You as well. This has been a really interesting conversation. It's really unique to hear so much about research in the tropics. It's very different from what I do. And I think I've learned of a few new things that will help me think differently about environments in general. So thank you for that.